Francis Arsentiev. On May 17, 1998, two climbers, Francis and Sergei Arsentiev, set out for Mount Everest. Francis was 40 years old from Colorado. Sergei was known as the Snow Leopard for climbing the Soviet Union's 5 highest peaks. Their plan was for Francis to become the first American woman to reach the summit without oxygen tanks. Mount Everest stands at 29,032 feet. At that height, there's only 1/3 of the oxygen you breathe at sea level. Francis and Sergei would climb without bottled oxygen, no radios, and no Sherpa support. Their 11-year-old son Paul had a nightmare the night before. Two climbers trapped on a mountain, unable to get down. Francis brushed off his fears. The climb was brutal. Without oxygen, every step above 26,000 feet felt like torture. On May 22nd, Francis reached the top at 2:30 p.m., but something was wrong. They had taken too long. The safe time to turn around was 2 p.m. Now it was getting dark, and they were in the death zone, the area above 26,000 feet where your body shuts down within hours. As night fell, the couple got separated coming down. Sergei made it back to camp. Francis didn't show up. When morning came, Sergei grabbed oxygen bottles and climbed back up to find her. Then he disappeared too. On May 24th, British climber Ian Woodall saw something in the snow. A person in purple clothes, lying still 1148 feet below the summit. It was Francis. She'd been lying there for 24 hours in minus 40 degrees Celsius and 70 miles per hour winds. The cold had messed with her brain, making her think she was burning up. She had stripped down to her underwear. Her hands and feet were black from frostbite. Ian tried to put clothes back on her, but her muscles had gone completely stiff. Her arms and legs wouldn't bend. Moving her was impossible at that height in knee-deep snow. After trying for over an hour, Ian had to choose. Stay with Francis and all three would die, or leave her and survive. He left her. Francis died that night. Her body stayed there for 9 years. Climbers called her Sleeping Beauty because her face looked peaceful and calm, like she was just taking a nap in the snow. They found Sergei's body the next year. He had fallen trying to reach his wife. In 2007, Ian came back and moved her body away from the climbing route, wrapping her in an American flag. David Sharp. On May 13, 2006, David Sharp, a 34-year-old British climber, set out alone for Mount Everest. Sharp was an experienced climber who had already done Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, and Cho Oyu. He was trying to reach the top without oxygen tanks, carrying only 2 bottles for emergencies. He had no radio, no Sherpa guide, and no team watching him. This was Sharp's 3rd try at Everest. In 2003, he turned back because of frostbite. In 2004, he came within 1148 feet of the top before giving up. This time, he was going to make it. On May 14th, several climbing groups saw Sharp at different spots along the route. Nobody knows if he reached the top. What we know is that on his way down, he took shelter in Green Boots Cave, a rocky spot at 27,890 feet, where another climber's body had been lying since 1996. Sharp was freezing and exhausted. He sat with his arms wrapped around his knees, icicles hanging from his eyelashes. The temperature was minus 20 degrees Celsius, and he had been without oxygen for hours. Then the other climbers started walking past him. Turkish climbers were the first to find Sharp early on May 15th. He was alive, but barely awake. They gave him oxygen and tried to help, but he was too weak to move. They kept going down. Later that morning, New Zealand climber Mark Inglis spotted Sharp in the cave. Inglis offered oxygen. Sharp said no. Inglis kept going to the top. All day long, 36 more climbers walked past Sharp on their way up or down the mountain. Some tried to give him medicine. Others tried to get him to stand up. Most just walked by, thinking he was already dead. By afternoon, Lebanese climber Maxim Chaya found Sharp with his face turned black from frostbite. Chaya stayed with him until he had to leave to save himself. Sharp died on May 15, 2006. Over 40 climbers had seen him dying. His body stayed in Green Boots Cave. The whole thing made people around the world angry about how climbers act on Everest. Even Sir Edmund Hillary, the first person to climb Everest in 1953, said the climbers who left Sharp were wrong. Perhaps the hardest part of Sharp's death is that so many saw the danger and walked by. And in our own lives, we often ignore risks too, like our personal data being exposed online. I realized this when I Googled my own name and email, and what I found was honestly terrifying. Page after page of data broker sites had my personal info, blurred here for privacy, but imagine seeing your phone number, your old addresses, even details about your family, just sitting there for anyone to buy. It feels violating. Data brokers collect and sell your information without your consent. They make billions selling it to marketers, scammers, and even stalkers. And while they're legally supposed to remove your info if you ask, they make that process intentionally confusing, so most people just give up. And this is where today's sponsor, Aura, comes in. Aura handles this automatically. They get your information taken down from these sites, and they keep it off. I use Aura myself, and I recommend it to my family and friends because it's the only way I actually feel protected online. And Aura isn't just about data brokers. It's an all-in-one digital security platform. It alerts you if your info is found on the dark web, gives real-time fraud warnings for your bank and credit, provides you with a VPN, antivirus and password manager, and even has 24/7 US-based support. Plus, if anything ever does happen, they back you with $5 million in identity theft insurance. It's honestly infuriating that companies are making money selling our lives like products. That's why I chose Aura. And you can try it free for 14 days with the link in my description or in the pinned comment. In those 2 weeks, you'll discover where your data is being exposed and sold. I'm not leaving myself vulnerable, and you shouldn't either. Thanks to Aura for sponsoring this video. Hannelore Schmatz. On October 1st, 1979, Hannelore Schmatz and her husband Gerhard went to climb Mount Everest as part of a German group. Hannelore was 39 years old and had climbed big mountains around the world with her husband. They both wanted to reach the top. Gerhard made it to the top on October 1st and got back down safely. He told Hannelore that the weather was getting bad and she should wait, but Hannelore said no. On October 2nd, Hannelore started climbing to the top with American climber Ray Janae and several Sherpas. The weather was terrible. Wind was blowing hard, snow was falling, and it was minus 30 degrees Celsius. But Hannelore kept going. At 1:30 p.m., she reached the top of Mount Everest. She made it, but now she had to get back down. Going down was horrible. Hannelore and Ray were moving too slow. They were tired and running out of oxygen. It was getting dark, and they were still in the death zone above 26,000 feet, where your body dies within hours. The Sherpa guides told them to keep moving. Stopping meant death. But Hannelore and Ray were too weak. They decided to spend the night at 28,000 feet, completely out in the freezing wind and cold. Sungdare Sherpa, one of their guides, stayed with them. By morning, Ray was dead. The cold had killed him during the night. Hannelore was barely alive. With Sundar's help, she tried to walk down. They made it just 330 feet before she fell down, only 328 feet above the safety of Camp 4. Her last words were asking for water before she died. Sungdare had to leave her body and keep going down alone. He lived, but lost most of his fingers and toes to frostbite. Hannelore's body stayed right where she fell. For years, she became a landmark on the climbing route. Climbers said she sat upright against her backpack, her eyes open, her hair blowing in the wind. She looked like a ghost watching everyone who walked by. In 1984, a big storm finally blew her body away, carrying her down the mountain where she disappeared forever. Hannelore Schmatz became the first woman to die on Mount Everest. Rob Hall. On May 10, 1996, Rob Hall, a 35-year-old guide from New Zealand, led his team toward the top of Mount Everest. Hall was one of the best guides on the mountain, having made it to the top 4 times before. His client that day was Doug Hansen, a 46-year-old mailman from Seattle who had tried to reach the summit the year before, but failed. Hall's group was part of a busy day on Everest. Another team, Mountain Madness, led by American guide Scott Fisher, was also trying to reach the summit. Both teams were charging clients $65,000 each for the chance to stand on top of the world. The climb started before sunrise, but problems began early. Safety ropes weren't set up at the Hillary Step, a narrow part just below the summit. This created dangerous waiting lines as dozens of climbers stood in line in the death zone above 26,000 feet. Hall had set a strict time to turn around at 2 p.m., whether they made it to the top or not. But as the day went on, that time came and went. Hansen was having trouble, moving slowly and using up oxygen fast. At 4 p.m., way past the safe time, Hansen finally reached the summit. Hall stayed with him, refusing to leave his client behind. But now they had to get down in the dark, and the weather was getting bad. Then, disaster struck. A huge storm hit the mountain. Winds reached 70 miles per hour, temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius, and they couldn't see anything. Climbers got lost in the storm just hundreds of feet from safety. Hansen ran out of oxygen near the south summit and couldn't go any further. Hall tried to help him down, but Hansen was too weak to move. Both men got trapped by the storm at 28,700 feet. Hall called base camp on his radio all night, his voice getting weaker each time. He was slowly freezing to death, but wouldn't leave Hansen. Other guides tried to reach them, but the weather was too dangerous. On the morning of May 11th, rescue teams made one last try to save Hall. They brought him oxygen and medicine, but by then, Hansen was dead, and Hall was barely awake from the cold. Hall's last radio call was to his pregnant wife John back in New Zealand. He told her he loved her and to take care of their baby girl. Then the radio went quiet. Rob Hall died on May 11th, 1996, still next to his client Doug Hansen. His body is still on the south summit of Mount Everest. The 1996 disaster killed 8 people total, making it one of the deadliest days in Everest history. Shreya Shah Chlorfine. On May 19, 2012, Shreya Shah Chlorfine, a 33-year-old from Toronto, went to climb Mount Everest. Shreya was born in Nepal and grew up in India before moving to Canada with her husband. Climbing Everest had been her dream since she was 9 years old, when she flew over it in a helicopter with her parents. Shreya had spent $100,000 on this trip, borrowing money against her house to pay for it. She trained by running up hills near her home while carrying a heavy backpack and rock climbing to get ready. But there were warning signs. Shreya was behind in her training, and people warned she might not make it. Her husband Bruce said she never told him about these worries. On May 18th, Shreya left Camp 4, the last camp before trying for the top. She was part of a group of over 500 climbers going up the mountain that day. The death zone above 26,000 feet was crowded, and climbers had to wait in long lines. The thin air made Shreya slow down. She was one of the last climbers still going up when others were already coming down. By the time she reached the top at 2:30 p.m. on May 19th, she was way past the safe time to turn around at 2 p.m. Her team leader begged her to go back as she got weaker, but she kept going. She was going to reach the top no matter what. At the summit, Shreya stood holding a Canadian flag, smiling behind her oxygen mask. She had done it, but now she had to get back down. Going down was horrible. Shreya was moving very slowly, and her speech became weird. She couldn't think clearly. She couldn't stand up by herself. The Sherpas had to pull and carry her down the mountain. She had been climbing for 24 hours and was on her 9th bottle of oxygen. Then, to make things worse, a storm hit, making it colder and windier. Shreya fell down and couldn't go any further. Shreya Shah Chlorfine died on May 19, 2012, while coming down from the summit. Her body was found near the climbing route with a Canadian flag placed over it. Her husband Bruce went to Nepal to bring her body home. Shreya had reached her dream of getting to the top of Everest, but it killed her. Joshua Cheruiyot. On May 22, 2024, Joshua Cheruiyot, a 40-year-old banker from Kenya, was climbing toward the top of Mount Everest. Joshua was trying to make history by becoming the first African to climb Everest without oxygen tanks. Joshua had been climbing mountains since he was a teenager. He had reached the top of Mount Kenya over 20 times. He climbed Mount Kilimanjaro in just 15 hours. In 2023, he became the first African to climb Mount Manaslu, the world's 8th highest mountain, without oxygen. But Everest was different. Climbing without oxygen on Everest is something less than 2% of climbers ever do. At heights above 26,000 feet, the air is so thin that most people need bottled oxygen just to stay alive. Joshua knew the risks. His Sherpa guide, Nawang, carried an emergency oxygen bottle, but Joshua had clear rules about when to use it, only if he passed out or the weather got too bad. On May 22nd, Joshua and Nawang left Camp 4 at 26,000 feet for their final push to the summit. The climb was hard. Every step without oxygen felt awful, but Joshua kept going. As they got higher, something went wrong. At Bishop Rock, just 160 feet below the summit, Joshua started acting weird. He was confused and wouldn't listen to Nawang. When Nawang tried to give him the emergency oxygen, Joshua said no. Joshua was so close to making history, just 160 feet from becoming the first African to reach the top of Everest without oxygen. But his body was shutting down from the thin air. Back at base camp, they lost radio contact with Joshua and Nawang. The last message was hard to understand, but it sounded like they were in trouble. Rescue teams looked for days, but couldn't find them in the bad weather. Finally, they found Joshua's body in a crack in the ice, just 160 feet below the summit. He had died trying to reach the summit. Nawang was never found. He disappeared trying to help Joshua. Joshua Cheruiyot died on May 22, 2024. His family decided not to bring his body down and left Joshua to rest in the mountains where he belonged. Scott Fisher. On May 10, 1996, Scott Fisher, a 40-year-old American guide, led his team toward the top of Mount Everest. He had climbed some of the world's biggest mountains without oxygen. That day, Fisher's team was trying to get to the top at the same time as another group led by Rob Hall from New Zealand. Both teams were going up on the same day, making dangerous crowds near the summit. The climb started before sunrise, but problems began early. There were long waits at the Hillary Step, a narrow part just below the summit. Climbers stood in lines in the death zone above 26,000 feet, using up oxygen and getting tired. Fisher had been feeling sick for days before trying for the summit. He was tired from helping other climbers who had gotten into trouble lower on the mountain, but he kept going because his clients needed him. By the time Fisher's team reached the top around 4 p.m., they were too late. The safe time to turn around was 2 p.m. Now they had to get down in the afternoon when the weather often gets bad. As they started going down, Fisher got sicker. The thin air was making him confused